Let's continue our journey in learning and thinking about our own Pennsylvania students and how we can consider culture and equity in our instruction. So, if we take a look at this image, just take a second to jot down a couple of things that you notice and a couple of things that you wonder about this. And if you need to stop the video to pause to think, please go ahead and do so. And when you're ready to press play, you can press play and pick up with what I'm going to talk about. So this image is interesting. This image has actually evolved over time. Whenever you hear people, or maybe you've seen some presentations about equity and equality, and probably the most famous image that's been circulating is a picture of these three students who are trying to look over a fence and see a baseball game, right? And those three students are all very different. You have a student who's really tall, a student who's really short, and a student who's in the wheelchair. So the concept of equality is, that everybody gets the same thing. So if you gave all three of those students looking over the fence the exact same sized box to stand on, it wouldn't quite work. Your tall student would probably be able to see over the fence. Your short student still wouldn't quite be there. And your student in a wheelchair can't stand on a box at all. So when we think about equality, that's giving everybody the same thing. But equity is giving everybody what they need in order to be successful. So then in that image that's very famous, you would see that each particular student was given either the right size box that they would need to see over, or like a ramp, or whatever kind of mechanism that student in a wheelchair would need in order to see over that fence to see the game. So that's the image that has been circulating. And now this image has kind of evolved from that. And we're looking at concepts of inequality, equality, equity, and then justice is brought into it as well. So if we think about what I've already said, when we look at inequality, of course, here we have unequal access to opportunities. We have a student over here who is just able to kind of have the opportunities as they are presented in life and given to them, shown here by this apple or orange, whatever it is that's falling from the tree. And our student over here, who just like as luck would have it, does not have access to anything. Here we can see equality is evenly distributed tools and assistance. So, like that box example I shared with you to see over the fence. So, here we have our two individuals who have the same size ladder. And we can see that this person right now is able to just pick all that fruit off the tree, no problem. But this person over here still can't access anything, even though they were given the same exact tools to do so. Equity then brings into consideration the custom tools that are provided for the individual based specifically on what they need. So now we have both individuals who can access the fruit on the tree. But see here how, this individual is still lined up with the part of the tree that is not producing nearly as much fruit as the other individual. And then, therefore, that brings about this concept then of justice. And justice is fixing the system so that we can offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. So here we see this graphic where, the whole tree has been manipulated and fixed, and whatever the tree needed to be able to produce fruit equally on both sides of the tree, whether some of those branches needed more light or whatever had to happen, the whole system was fixed in order to provide that equal access to both tools and opportunities for the student. So that's a little bit about this graphic, so you can reflect on that. The evolution of that graphic certainly has changed over time. So moving on then, we want for you to think about and engage in a little bit of a reflective activity. So reflect on your own culture. How do the various aspects of your own identity, upbringing, beliefs, values, and lived experiences shape your thinking and understanding of the world? This is something, of course, this is a private reflection. Think about all of the things that make you who you are and how they have shaped how you see the world. So take a couple minutes to do that. You can jot down some notes. Again, pause the video if you need to. Really think about that. When you're ready, press play again. And then the next thing you're going to do is think about how your culture and the aspects of your identity differ from those of the learners who sit in your classroom, how they differ from their families, and how might the various aspects of your culture differ from your colleagues. So take a minute and think about that again. And same thing, pause the video if you need to, jot down a couple of things, and then hit play whenever you're ready to go. If we were all together in person here, we would have a small group discussion. We wouldn't share ideas from that first question that you answered, which really asked you to personally think about your own culture. But we would have a discussion about how your culture differs from your students, their families, and your colleagues. I can share a quick example with you when I think about when I first started teaching and the differences in the culture that I experienced. I taught in a very, very small rural school district, and I didn't grow up in a small rural school district. I was very suburban, and at first, I thought that, oh, there probably aren't too many differences in where I grew up and now where I'm teaching, but there were a lot of differences. I didn't understand a lot about the culture of my students and their families. Um, a lot of the students that I taught were from very economically disadvantaged families, and just learning about the different perceptions of the value of education and just different activities that my students and their families would be engaged in on the weekends. Like, everything was different than how I grew up. And the school I taught in was only 30 minutes away from where I grew up. So, my naivety as a beginning teacher and thinking, oh, I'll probably know and understand this area, it was definitely very different. So think about that, and then think about some ways in which we can learn about our students' culture, interests, and backgrounds. When I started to understand that I didn't understand my students and their culture and backgrounds, I started to think of ways to get to know them a little bit more. And I was an English teacher, so I was able to do that through a lot of my students' writing, through asking them prompts, or structuring assignments to get them to think about and to explain to me or bring into the assignment those different interests and backgrounds that they had. And then once I started learning about it, I was able to tailor my assignments to their interests. So if we were learning about subject verb disagreement in a paragraph, I might create a bunch of different sample paragraphs for my students and tailor it to their interests and backgrounds. So if this student really liked dirt bike racing or quads, we could create a paragraph about that. If this student over here really liked horseback riding, then we can create a paragraph about that. So just learning and listening to them, and finding ways to learn about their culture and backgrounds, that was really important. So why are we considering culture in our science classrooms? Well, I think it's important to consider culture in science classrooms because there's a lot of topics in science that really kind of lend to specific cultures, or maybe don't coincide with some beliefs in specific cultures. So just really thinking about how to navigate those situations, how to learn about our students and their families, so that we can, design lessons and assignments that will capitalize on differences, and also, work toward helping students understand the science. So this tree is an interesting image. It's called the culture tree. And there's a lot of things that we can learn about this image. Um, you see that there are three different types of culture represented in this tree. We have surface culture, shallow culture, and deep culture. And I'll just give you a quick explanation of kind of what's happening here. But here we see that in our surface culture, these are elements of culture that are observable. So, for instance, when we're learning about different cultures, we might see observable features like songs that they listen to, or the holidays that they celebrate, or what do they cook? What's their food like? These are all elements of surface culture, and it's important to recognize that when we're talking about elements of surface culture, these are elements that have low emotional charge. If there are any changes to these elements in someone's culture, it typically doesn't create a lot of high anxiety. Then you move into shallow culture. And these are some unspoken rules about culture. You can see some examples like concepts of time, personal space, eye contact, these elements of shallow culture, they do have a strong emotional charge. So if there are any social violations of these norms, sometimes it can cause mistrust, distress, or social friction. And I had never recognized that before. So when I think about students that I taught from different cultures, they didn't want to make eye contact with me. And I thought, oh, they're just being disrespectful, and I'm asking them, hey, can you look at me whenever I'm talking to you? Now, all of a sudden, I don't understand something that's a shallow culture element. And, maybe I'm asking them something that's creating a level of mistrust, for them with me, or distress. And then when we look at deep culture, these are collective unconscious beliefs and norms. So this is really, elements about like their faith, their religion, cosmology, how the world began, their spirituality in general, and if what their concept is of a higher power, their notions of fairness, preferences for completion or cooperation, their relationships to nature and animals. And this level of culture has intense emotional charge. And anytime something in the deep culture realm is challenged, then there could be some shock to the individual, or it could trigger the brain's fight or flight response. And I had never known that before. So sometimes when we think about, and this isn't just in science classrooms. I mean, I can think of a ton of different examples in my English language arts class and the literature that we were reading. Different topics or things that came up that, really kind of dance around, and not even just dance around, sometimes outright talk about elements that I see here in this deep culture area. And so that's something that, when I think about reflecting back on my time in the classroom, that, man, I could have been a lot more proactive about some different discussion points and things that came up in the classroom around these elements of deep culture. And so that's why we're considering culture in our classrooms and in our science classrooms too. So I think that this is just a good graphic to reflect on and think about, wow, like there's really a different emotional response to various elements of someone's culture, just related to, I'm sorry, one second, just related to where that element might fall on, that particular branch of the tree. So, what is culture? Well, there are many definitions of culture. UNESCO defines culture as the set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features of a society or a social group that encompasses not only art and literature, but lifestyles, ways of living together, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. So here is our definition of culture. If we were in a group face to face working together, I probably would have asked you to come up with a working definition of culture yourselves. But here is a definition for you to use to help guide you as you think about culturally responsive instruction in your classroom. And of course, it's important for us to understand that culture is multifaceted. It can exist at multiple levels. Some aspects of an individual's culture include, but are not limited to, their racial and ethnic culture, their local culture, their national culture, of course, their youth culture or generational culture, and their religious culture. One individual can have multiple cultures, and that culture is probably different from that of the teacher in the classroom. So, I know earlier in this training you were looking at some of the competencies for culturally responsive education that PDE put out. And just so that you know, we actually have engaged in the first competency, which is reflecting on one's cultural lens. So, throughout just this video, you were able to reflect on your own cultural lens. And then you are also able to compare your cultural lens to that of those around you in the workplace. And then we also had the chance to engage a little bit with competency two, which is to identify, deepen understanding of, and finally, this little part we didn't get to yet, but that'll be in some of the evidence section that you have in this learning experience. Take steps to address bias in the system. So here is where we really want to think about making efforts to remove bias in teaching materials, assignments, curriculum, and allocation of resources. So if we are intentionally increasing, let's say, for example, learners' access to advanced courses and enrollment in enrichment opportunities based on, elements of their culture or even their school district or community, then that's not being really culturally responsive. We have to think about all of our students and thinking about how can we provide opportunities to access advanced placement course material to all of our students. That's just an example of taking steps to address bias in the system, because whether we want to admit it or not, sometimes those kinds of courses maybe are only offered to a certain type of student. So that's just an example of something to consider whenever we think about taking steps to address bias in the system. So thank you for listening to this part of the video, and go ahead and continue in your learning experience.